We believe that the United Kingdom should follow the international law. We are not ready to talk in the way of the ultimatums.
Earlier, British Prime Minister Theresa May announced tough retaliatory measures against Moscow after the Kremlin missed that deadline to explain how a Russian-developed nerve gas was used to poison a former Russian spy and his daughter.
This represents an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom.
May said 23 Russian diplomats would be expelled, the largest such purge since the Cold War. The measures also include freezing Russian state assets that may pose a security threat and not sending the royals or British MPs to this summer's Soccer World Cup. Theresa May has also vowed to root out Russian criminals and corrupt elites.
There is no place for these people or their money in our country. Mr. Speaker,
this escalation of tensions between the two countries is rattling some Russians who now call the UK home. As Thomas Daigle tells us, they fear they're all being painted with the same brush.
With moneyed neighborhoods like Kensington and Mayfair, London knows how to cater to the super rich. Attracting oligarchs and exiles, this city's so full of Russian money, they call it Londongrad and Moscow-on-Thames. All the better for Yevgeny Chichvarkin and his wine shop, stocking bottles only the wealthy can afford. A change of pace from his previous career as a Moscow cell phone tycoon who spoke out a little too loudly against corruption in Russia and left in a hurry.
I'm worried about myself and my family, of course. It's still 10 times safer than in Russia.
The attack on Sergei and Yulia Skripal and the fallout has been bad news all around for Russian Londoners.
People are starting to say, yes, those guys brought chemical weapons to our territory. And this impacts on the Russians living here because they are associated with this supposedly barbarian policy.
Mr. Speaker, as I set out,
announcing Britain's retaliation today, the Prime Minister aimed carefully.
Many Russians have made this country their home, abide by our laws, and make an important contribution to our country, which we must continue to welcome. But to those who seek to do us harm, my message is simple. You are not welcome here.
She set her sights most pressingly here on the Russian embassy, the center of what May called an espionage network in the UK. Not every Russian in London's a spy, though some sense they're being cast as the enemy. Oleg Kashin will be home with his son tonight, but he says he's still not made to feel at home here.
For you, for everyone, Russians are Russians, and me, I'm Russian, and I think Theresa May says Russians, and she means me too.
Still, he needed to find a new home after this in 2010, getting beat to a pulp in Moscow after criticizing a Putin ally. As much as Britain can stand up to the Russian president, Kashin says it only serves to embolden Putin and his view of the West.
And I think today Putin became stronger.
Tonight, London police escorted vehicles from the embassy. Whether diplomats or spies, they're on their way out, while this crisis only seems to be growing. Thomas Daigle, CBC News, London.
But while Russian expats may not necessarily know how to feel about all of this, the power players in London and Moscow certainly do. As Susan Ormison explains, you can expect both sides to start swinging at each other even harder.
As if by design, as Britain tossed Russian diplomats, President Putin sent hugs to Crimeans on a campaign trip. Annexing Crimea still one of the biggest irritants between Russia and the West. Expect in coming days, Moscow will throw out British diplomats in equal numbers as it forecasts freezing relations. The Russian embassy tweeting, "We're not afraid of cold weather." But did May's reaction rattle Russia? No. Wholly inadequate, says Bill Browder, Putin's arch critic.
So if Britain really wanted to do something, and they still have the opportunity to do it, they should go out and freeze and seize property in the UK, which amounts to a lot, of the Russian government officials there and Kremlin-connected oligarchs. That would make Putin pay attention.
Expulsions traditionally are the way angry countries punish each other, the biggest nearly 50 years ago, when the UK kicked out 90 intelligence officers. Most recently, President Obama ousted 35 Russian diplomats for influencing the U.S. election, but there was no tit for tat. Moscow chose not to antagonize incoming President Trump. Russian relations have sunk since then.
This was a highly irresponsible act of terrorism by Vladimir Putin, and 23 is a drop in the bucket.
This is a question of the culpability of the Russian state.
In this case, the UK has indicated the expulsions are a first step.
The response is largely symbolic. It's meant to send a message to a domestic audience to say that despite a lot of questions about May's leadership, she's prepared to act tough.
The timing matters for Putin, too, who must calculate Russia's response with one eye on the election Sunday.
So, Susan, Theresa May obviously had some options. What else could she have done?
Oh, she could have boycotted the World Cup in Russia entirely, making English footballers very unhappy. She could have restricted Russian television, RT, in Britain, but the Kremlin said it would expel journalists in Moscow. Or she could work on this seizure of assets, and that may come.
And all this tough talk just kept going at the UN today, right?
Yes, the ambassador from the U.S. to the UN, Nikki Haley, had this to say.
If the Russian government stopped using chemical weapons to assassinate its enemies, and if Russia cooperated with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons by turning over all information related to this nerve agent, we would stop talking about them.
Okay, so that is strikingly harsh from Nikki Haley. Let's see how that lands. But what about the Canadian reaction?
Well, Trudeau spoke to Britain today, and Chrystia Freeland's office issued a statement saying that all states should cooperate with the British investigation and said that it was Russia's likely involvement and condemned it for that.
Okay, Susan, thanks very much.
You're welcome.